India is hosting the AI Impact Summit 2026 in New Delhi. It is the first AI summit in the Global South and talks about how artificial intelligence can be used for the welfare of the society and how safety rules and other policies are required to prevent its misuse. The summit is being hailed everywhere in the world, with global leaders lavishing praise on India's approach to artificial intelligence and the visionary leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, to talk more on this, I am joined by Professor N.M. Anup Krishnan. He is the Associate Professor of IIT Delhi. Hi sir, a very warm welcome to DD India News Hour. With over 100 plus countries participating in this summit, various startups are there, delegates from various countries, heads of states from around 20 countries. The India AI Impact Summit 2026 is setting new benchmarks. There's no doubt about that, and it's the first AI summit taking place in the Global South. What is your take on India's leadership here, its approach to artificial intelligence and long-term vision, and the way it is focusing on the constructive use of artificial intelligence?
Namaste, and thanks a lot for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, giving my thoughts on this. So I think one of the key points that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized in this is the idea of M.A.N.A.V, and especially the theme has been sovereign AI.
Right.
Now, why is this really important? For example, if you have been looking at it, different countries have taken different stance on AI.
Right.
For instance, Europe has been primarily looking at regulations, right?
Right.
While US has been looking primarily at innovations, and they have been driving innovations. And India has taken a very, very carefully thought out, well thought out stance on it with this idea of M.A.N.A.V. Because what are we talking about this? We are talking about moral and ethical systems, we are talking about accountable governance and sovereignty, and we are also talking about being inclusive and making it valid and legitimate, right? That's what this idea of M.A.N.A.V actually stands for. So this just does not say that we should push for innovation blindly, but we should do it in a responsible fashion, and that's what India is pushing for. And I think this is a really great stance that we are taking, and also kind of leading the way in showing what is how Global South can be included, while also making sure that we contribute to the entire world.
Right. You just talked about that different countries are having a different approach when it comes to artificial intelligence. Does it also mean that there are different set of guidelines and rules that the countries are making for their artificial intelligence?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the usage regulations, the data regulations, it's very, very different in Europe versus US, right? So, for example, some data, for example, Europe has very clear classification of what's sensitive data, what's critical, and all that, and there are clear regulations that such kind of data cannot be used for training the model, because when you train a model with such data, it actually starts memorizing this, right? And that creates its own challenges. But if you think of India, India has its own unique challenges. For instance, India does not have a homogeneous population. We have 22 languages, scheduled languages, right? But there are some more interesting challenges that India presents. And for example, one is that we have a lot of tribal languages. And for instance, a colleague of mine from IIT Delhi has been working on tribal languages and how to develop AI for tribal languages. And this is an example of being inclusive, right? Another example is of languages like, there are several languages in India which does not have a script. For example, Konkani is one such language, which does not have a script, but it's it can be written in Hindi or some other language. So how do you even go about such languages? So India presents problems in India are unique problems, but the solutions would be global in nature, right? So and all these aspects have to be taken into account while we develop AI models, and that's the reason why built in India can also be truly built for the world.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi sir also emphasized on the safety rules. So when different countries are having a different approach towards artificial intelligence, is the safety rules also different for different countries, and can there be a common protocol as far as the safety in artificial intelligence is concerned?
See, this is actually a very important question, and I don't think there is a global agreement on how do we even address this problem. Now, why is this so? Because artificial intelligence, I mean, if you look at the the point. I mean, and again, invoking invoking the speech by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he has clearly identified the main difference between artificial intelligence to other developments. Like, he made a parallel between this wireless communication and artificial intelligence. But the main difference which he highlighted is that the pace with which it's growing is phenomenal, right? For example, ChatGPT as a language model came in 2022, and we are right now in 2026, and the developments and the percolation that it has achieved is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And this is why, for example, some countries, several countries in Europe has been very careful in adoption and had tried to do regulations, but then the innovation is at such a pace that you cannot stop those. So we are still figuring out what are the best ways. How do we address fairness? How do you address say safety, right? And how do you address these issues while deploying AI systems? So it's very difficult at this point to say that we will have one rule for the entire globe. But I think what will happen is that we will understand the challenges, and according to the requirements and according to the local, for example, each countries have their own priorities, their own, culture and thought about this and the social setup, etc. So accordingly, the safety and other rules should locally evolve as per the requirements. But I think a more important aspect is the understanding of this, the scientific understanding of what are the challenges that needs to be addressed.
Right. I also think that artificial intelligence is in its growing stage. However, it is growing really fast, but it is in its growing stage. So different rules and sets of regulations will be developed over time when this technology will further evolve. I think. How do you analyze the economic impact of artificial intelligence now when we are talking about the job opportunities it will create in the future?
So, I mean, just to close on the first aspect, even if you look at the global leaders of AI, right? I mean, there are two schools of thought. Some of them are saying that, AI is very dangerous, you have to be very careful, while others are saying that, it's not at all, it's really advancing civilization and things like that, right? And this is also to do with the economic impact, which is what you brought out as a second point. For instance, there are key areas that the companies are keen on, and the government is also keen on. Governments across the world are keen on in deploying AI. For example, AI in medtech, AI in healthcare, AI in education, AI for science, AI for weather forecasting. Now, each of these areas in itself have huge economic impact. For example, right, if you can real-time forecast the weather, how the rain is going to happen, how each of this is going to happen, this can actually give information on flood forecasting and other dangers, and we can mobilize people and save a lot of human lives, and also the economic burden that would come because of such damages that could otherwise happen, right? So this is just a very simple example of how AI can help. For example, AI based weather forecasting can help, but AI driven materials discovery is another area. For example, if you can discover a room temperature superconductor, and the other example is that of for example, AlphaFold, which won Nobel Prize in 2024, which is maybe one of the shortest spans to Nobel Prize. For example, AlphaFold was developed in 2018, and in 6 years it was able to get to prize. And this clearly tells you the economic impact. But for a country like India with 1.4 billion population and growing, if AI for education, AI tools can be used for education, then the economic impact that it will have will be huge.
Definitely. Talking about that, sir, what are the challenges now and the risks related to artificial intelligence, and how is India championing in countering these?
Right. So as I said, the earlier point, just elaborating on that.
Okay.
See, for example, 10% of the Indian population, only 10 to 15% of Indian population can read and write English, fluently, right? So that means we have around 85% of the population who does not have access to the English language. Now, if we can make use of artificial intelligence for real-time translation and education and things like that, that in itself is a huge percolation that we are achieving and inclusivity that we are achieving. But what are the risks? For example, one of the major risks is hallucination, right? When you use this large language models, it can always output results, but those results may or may not be meaningful, right? It can give you wrong information. So the key challenge in using artificial intelligence is the reliability of those forecast and prediction. How do you make sure that this is not and the dependence on the training data? For example, again, most of this data, at least in the initial works on large language models, have been trained on the West, and when it gets adopted to the countries like India, so we have unique challenges, as I said earlier, and those challenges need to be addressed to make it work in India. So I think while it is clearly a tool that can really accelerate, there are lots of challenges in simply adopting it. The idea of hallucination, for example, when you're using in education, you cannot give a wrong information, right? I mean, student cannot learn a wrong information and then think that is the right information. But at the same time, even in things like weather forecasting, for example, if you have a wrong forecast, the impact of that can be really, really, even the direct economic impact can be.
So in short, what is the way to tackle it?
So there are several works
will AI or should I say, will AI tackle AI?
That's an interesting question, and I think the way, I mean, there is a lot of researchers working on this topic, and this is an active area of research. But what the most common way is uncertainty quantification. For example, can AI say that I am giving you this prediction, but with what certainty am I making this prediction? I can say I have 100% sure of the answer, or I say, I'm only 50% sure of the answer. And this is the way to quantify, for example, uncertainty in the prediction, right? And this is one way people are tackling this issue, but there are many other ways of tackling this, which is for example, interpretability and explainability. For example, if you show it to a domain expert, they would say, oh, okay, this makes sense because of this, right? For example, if you talk to a medical doctor, they look at an X-ray or a scan and then they say, oh, this bone is fractured because of this, right? And that's where the interpretability and explainability comes in. And there is a lot of research on explainable AI and interpretable AI, and also on uncertainty quantification. And these are some of the ways we can make sure that the models that we have are robust, the predictions are reliable, and that can be reliably used and deployed for safe use in the society.
Definitely. And also, like Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, that it's not that important what AI can do in future, but what we are doing with it right now. This is the important thing, what we are doing with the artificial intelligence at this moment. And that's why the summit, the India AI Impact Summit 2026, where the world leaders will gather under one roof and talk about how we can constructively use the artificial intelligence and omit out the factors to misuse, to prevent the misuse of artificial intelligence as well. So we leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on DD India News.